Okay, so Barry, we're going to chat about compassion. Anytime we've chatted in our cafes around the city of Dublin, I think compassion is something that we've either directly or indirectly talked about in terms of the journey that we've both been on in work and life, and how important it's been. Um, Maybe I'll kick off, and again, sure, Barry, come in. I tend to defer to you, Barry, on a lot of these things, as you'll have noted in our coffee chats and in this. So, at any point, come in as I'm chatting, and then I'll leave the floor to you to give us the. I described Barry last week as the emerging force in mindfulness in Ireland, so that's why I tend to defer to Barry in all matters. Barry is incredibly uncomfortable with the title.
Yeah.
However, I kind of like that too. Uh,
Thanks, man. I need some compassion for myself now. It's like cringe.
so basically, compassion. Look, for me, I mentioned last week, compassion is something that I suppose probably for the first 33 or 4 years of my life, I had an eternal struggle with. I set hugely high bars, as I mentioned last week, and therefore, anytime life or me failed to deliver at that high bar, I just would get a very negative response to it. And that would lead to anger, frustration, both internally and externally to the world or people in it. And, and so basically that's what mindfulness probably and the whole spirit of mindfulness came to a huge aid to me with this in mind. And I suppose there's been a couple of things that I wanted to share really. The first is a stat that I found which helped to put my own personal perspective into context. And it was doing a self-compassion 8-week course. And the teacher told us about stats on our ability to give compassion. And the stats divided us into 3 categories. Category 1 is people who are more comfortable at giving compassion outward to others than they are to give it to themselves. Category 2 was people who are as compassionate, so just as comfortable giving compassion to themselves as they are to others. Category 3 was those who are more comfortable giving compassion to themselves than they are to others. So even if you just reflect for even just a second, just think, where do you see yourself? You don't have to say this out loud, but where do you see yourself in across those 3 categories? Well, at the time of doing this course, I firmly found myself in category 1, i.e. I found it a lot easier to give compassion to others than I did to myself. And I found the stats very reassuring because it was like 78% of people are in that category, i.e. they find it easier to give compassion outward than they do to themselves. 20% of people found themselves in an equal status, i.e. finding it as easy to give it outwards as to themselves. And that's such a tiny portion. 2% found it easier to give compassion to themselves than they did to others. So for me, I guess I found that incredibly reassuring to kind of go, well, number one, actually, look, it is hard. And look, it clearly is hard because the vast majority of people are in the same boat as me. So I suppose that just grounded myself to realize, okay, this is not me. This is a universal experience in the main. So then I guess that just gave me comfort. The second kind of element then that I found very important was a concept that I both heard and kind of almost came to realize myself, which I call the oxygen mask effect. And the oxygen mask effect has really allowed me to appreciate the importance of compassion. And ultimately, like the 78%, I do love to help others. I do love to give compassion out. Like, I do want to give compassion to myself as much as I can, but I do love to give compassion outwards. I come from a very caring, strong family. I have a mother who's a nurse, a sister who's a physio, a dietitian, and my youngest sister, a nurse also. So there's a strong caring gene in the family. So we do love to care for others. So the oxygen mask effect has become very important for me as a concept. And the oxygen mask effect comes from the safety demonstration on any flight that you're on. And when they're given the safety demonstration, they talk about a loss of cabin pressure. And in that instance, immediately oxygen masks come down. And in this scenario, every flight, we're given one piece of advice. You almost don't need me to tell you what it is. the advice is that we put on our own oxygen mask first before we could help to others. And for me, in relation to compassion, it just made me realize, actually, do you know what? While I love to care for people, I can't do that in the best way. I can't do that with any real quality unless I'm looking after myself. So there are two things that I found hugely helpful. I genuinely say that it's an art and it's a challenge to be compassionate consistently to yourself, and therefore to be able then to give quality compassion to others. And I actually found a stat delivering a session earlier in last year that made me realize just the challenge that being compassionate to yourself is. Think about in society who are the greatest and most important compassion or caregivers that we have. And this is brought to life more than ever before by what's happening right now. For me, it is our frontline staff, and particularly led by doctors, led by consultants. There was a study on wellness across that cohort of people, doctors and consultants. And I just want to share 4 stats that I found in the report that just strikes to me the challenge around compassion. So number 1, 80% of doctors have low levels of physical activity. 4 out of 5 doctors reported working at a time when they were ill or injured. 4 in 5 doctors do not have enough time in family or personal life due to work commitments. 79% of doctors feel that they overcommit to their work. For me, they are striking stats that prove the challenge of compassion. And what I said to the audience of doctors and consultants at the time is there was something quite particular about the numbers. 4 out of 5, 80%, 79%. They are all remarkably close to the stat that I heard at the self-compassion workshop, i.e. that 78% of people find it easier to give compassion outwards than they do to themselves. And yet here's a cohort of people who society needs to be good at giving compassion to themselves, because we need them to be giving good quality of care and compassion to us. And that's never more important than it is today as we try and fight a pandemic, a health-driven pandemic. So I guess both that and that stat show that it's a challenge. The oxygen mask effect shows to me how important it is to be compassionate. And therefore, for me, what I've been trying to do over the last 3, 4, 5 years is find ways to be compassionate to myself. And there are so many little tricks and tools that I've learned. I mentioned one last week, and it's to try and find any symbol of compassion that you can have about yourself on a day. I have a simple, small, soft, round stone, smooth. I'm in my hand right now, and it's on my desk most days. It's there as both a visual reminder, and it's also there as a physical reminder just to hold in my hand from times when I feel whatever type of negative emotions coming, and it's a reminder to ground myself and to be compassionate in that time. So I guess that's been my experience, and I'm just constantly trying to find ways to build my levels of compassion, because I know it's good for me and I know it's good for others. I'm going to pause now with that. And I hope that this has helped you, one, just to show and bring a universal feel on the challenge of compassion. Show that no matter where you are in terms of compassion, there's an opportunity to move across that stat to where you can be as compassionate to yourself, or even where you can be better, again, more compassionate to yourself than others, which allows you to place a metaphorical oxygen mask to yourself. Barry, I'm going to hand over to you now. How does that land, and what advice, what tips can you give us or insights around your experience?
Yeah, what you feel free, the same as with, if something really resonates or you see a different thing come in. Yeah, like what you're sharing there is definitely true, that we find it easier to, and even sometimes the word compassion can be tricky or confusing, but even if you took it really simply, we find it easier to be kind to another person, particularly a good friend or something. And we don't find it so easy, most of us, to show that same kindness to ourselves. So that's true for me. Definitely, I'm in the 80% category. And that's why I find the practice really helpful. So then as well, like what would be most helpful for, 15 minutes or 10 minutes that we have, the understanding of what compassion is. Compassion is when kindness meets suffering. So for compassion to arise, there must be a difficulty. And then last week we were talking about suffering, and suffering can seem like this, like, oh, this something horrific. It doesn't actually have to. It's something completely normal. I think an example from real life is probably the best way of just showing how I use it. So I was on a call 2 nights ago, and like a Zoom call, and I was tired. I'd been doing too much Zooming, and the person on the call sort of triggered me a little bit, the way they were. I could feel myself like just becoming a bit like not liking it. And then it was my turn to speak, and then this feeling kind of was there as I was speaking, and I was more direct than I normally would be, because I just didn't like the way the conversation was being brought. And then so the call's over, and then I had, that night I'm lying in bed, as we all do, and you can kind of relive this thing, and I felt just this cringe, this like, oh God, I wish I had just not said anything. It wasn't that bad or anything, but I felt I was so hard on myself, and I moving in the bed nearly just to get away from the feeling, just turning this way and this way. I don't like it. And then it stayed with me the next day, and I was kind of, doing the practice, and I was like, okay, yeah. And the trap, it's so hard, I think, to be kind to ourselves, because we refuse to actually acknowledge the suffering. That's the first step. It's almost like the analogy that makes sense to me is, the stereotypical parent where the child is upset or hurt for some reason, and it's like the parent rushes in immediately and is like, shh, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, without even giving a few moments to go, what's wrong? God, that's tough. And so for me, that's the first step. There's 3 ingredients to self-compassion. There's number 1, the acknowledgement of suffering, of the difficulty, if suffering is a hard word. So number 1, and this is what I did. I kind of sat there and I was like, God, yeah, this doesn't feel very nice. I notice all this tension in my body, and this kind of, contraction. I notice my breathing is kind of a bit more shallow, and it was unpleasant. And I had all these thoughts as well, like imagining what another person thought, and just the whole mix of an unpleasant experience. That's step 1, is to actually, if we can, without overwhelming ourselves, go, okay, this is the way it is. This right now is a little bit difficult, or very difficult. Who knows what we all go through. And then the second piece I find the most helpful, which is, this is suffering. And then the second piece is common humanity. So, and you spoke about this last week too. So it's like, okay, every single one of us on this call probably resonates with what I shared. We all have those experiences. We all go to sleep at night going, oh, you're an idiot. You're an idiot. Oh God, why'd you do that? We all do that. And we all go through tough times. So it's just, it takes the magnifying glass off me and my experience. It's lovely when you think like, okay, how many million other people are in this same boat? And we're all trying to do our best, blundering our way through life as best we can. So for me, that's helpful. It's not strange, it's normal, it's part of life. Loads of other people feel this without diminishing what I feel. And then the third piece, after those 2 steps have, been gone through, we've kind of met the suffering, and we've kind of opened our perspective a little to see it's everyone, it's normal. Then there's kindness. So we meet the suffering with kindness. And you can be so creative in this part. So it really might be, what would help? What would I do for my friend? And maybe this is too detailed, but there's 2 ways you can kind of approach it in terms of giving the kindness to yourself. There's a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. So the top-down approach is sort of, what you say to yourself, the self-talk that you might engage in. You go, oh, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe, And that can be difficult, actually, particularly if I'm triggered and then I try to kind of, talk some sense into myself or try and pick the right words or something. That's really hard. So sometimes, and I don't know if this is true for you guys, the bottom up approach where you actually work with the body can be extremely helpful for a start. So a very kind thing to do for me is to maybe even take, one deep breath or 3 deep breaths. Could all do that together and just see what that feels like. A little bit of a sigh when you breathe out. And so simple. Sometimes it can kind of, allow the body and allow the system to settle when we breathe out. Or another thing that's been shown, there's a whole lot of research around this too, is touch. So if you imagine, your good friend had a difficult experience, one of the first most instinctive things you might do for your good friend is, put your hand on their shoulder. You do that quite naturally. And without even having to say any words or anything, it's like, okay, look, it's okay, I'm here, it's all right. So they've shown when you're practicing compassion, that is actually something we can do for ourselves. Just I would do that a lot, just, physical touch. Put your hand on your chest, or if that feels too like, my hand on my heart, you could be subtle. You could, fold your arms a little, which unbeknownst to everyone else, you're giving yourself a bit of a hug. Or even just noticing that there's that feeling of touch. That can be really nice. Breathing is really useful because Paul Gilbert is the guy who's done loads of research around compassion, and he's identified these different systems we have: a threat system, a drive system, and a soothing system. And the soothing system is when we are more likely to be receptive to compassion, and one way of activating it is breathing. So when the breath slows and when you breathe out, just things start to settle, and then something can land a little bit more easily, perhaps. So I maybe that's kind of enough for me to say. Mm-hmm. One other tiny thing I noticed too, or just to say, the word compassion can be a real block for people too. And you would have noticed that on the course, probably you did with Mary. Like, I think they addressed that first. It's like, okay, so what are your blocks? How do you find some aversion towards the word compassion? And people have to start calling it resilience and other words that are more acceptable to them, even though it's just being kind,
Totally. It's funny when you talked about like compassion and finding ways to be compassionate. I don't know why, not really appropriate for like 9:20, but ice cream was just what came into my mind, right? I don't know. I just had an overwhelming vision of ice cream. That's just me talking out loud. A question for you, Barry. What happens if we have to try and go through this process of just recognizing the suffering, trying to create a common humanity connection to that suffering, and then trying to find an act of suffering when we're in the presence of one or more people, and specifically when we're in the presence of one or more people in a work setting? What advice would you have to try and navigate?
Yeah, but gosh, like I think it comes down to, there's no one answer, but certainly to be careful with all these things. If you stop and go, oh yeah, this is really hard, like there's a possibility, like you said, it's an art and a skill. There's a possibility that you might become like a little bit overwhelmed by that difficulty. So maybe choosing the time and place for it. Distraction isn't always a bad thing, Sometimes distraction might be useful. I think if you learn it, it's something that I can do even in 30 seconds. It's just a little moment to stop. And it might be that I kind of recognize, okay, I'm a little bit triggered right now. This isn't so nice. And how many other people are like this right now? Many. And then just a little sigh or my jaw might relax a little. Can be a little micro moment. It doesn't need to be this big, intense meditation that you go through and that can be nice to do in the right setting as well.
Fantastic.